Hi guys, welcome back to another deep dive into history. Tonight, we're stepping away from the chaos of modern life and traveling back nearly 800 years to explore the quiet, contemplative world of a medieval monastery. We're going to spend the next few hours together walking through the stone corridors of St. Benedict's Abbey, experiencing the daily rhythms that governed the lives of monks who dedicated themselves entirely to prayer, work, and scholarship. This isn't a story of adventure or excitement, but rather an intimate look at the peaceful, methodical existence that these religious men chose for themselves during the 13th century. We'll follow Brother Thomas through his typical day, from the pre-dawn prayers to the evening silence, discovering how these communities sustained themselves both spiritually and practically during an era when the outside world was often turbulent and unpredictable. You'll learn about their simple meals, their careful copying of manuscripts, their tending of gardens, and their commitment to a life of service that many of us today might find both foreign and fascinating. Okay, friends, before you settle in, if you enjoy this kind of deep dive content, then click the like button and don't forget to subscribe. And yes, leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. I really enjoy seeing where everyone is listening from. Now, dim the lights and turn on the fan, and let's dive into tonight's journey together. The bell tower of St. Benedict's Abbey stood 47 feet above the surrounding countryside, its bronze bell casting a clear, penetrating tone across the rolling hills of what would one day become the English countryside. On this particular morning in the year 1247, the bell rang out at precisely 3:30, as it had every morning for the past 63 years since the monastery's founding. The sound echoed off the stone walls of the dormitory, where 28 monks slept on simple wooden beds covered with rough woolen blankets. Brother Thomas stirred at the first peal of the bell, though his eyes remained closed for several more moments. At 34 years old, he had been living within these walls for nearly 16 years, having arrived as a young man of 18 with little more than the clothes on his back and an earnest desire to serve. The morning call to matins was as familiar to him as his own heartbeat, yet he still took a moment each day to offer a silent prayer of gratitude for being awakened to another day of service. The dormitory was a long, narrow room with small windows set high in the walls. Each monk's sleeping area consisted of a bed, a small wooden chest for personal belongings, and a simple wooden cross mounted on the wall. The floor was made of large stone slabs that remained cool even in summer and were particularly cold during the winter months. Brother Thomas swung his feet over the side of his bed and felt the familiar shock of cold stone against his bare soles. He reached for the simple brown wool habit that hung on a wooden peg beside his bed, pulling it over his head and adjusting the rope belt around his waist. Around him, his brothers were performing the same quiet ritual. No one spoke during this time, as the rule of their order demanded silence until after the morning prayers. The only sounds were the soft shuffling of feet, the rustle of fabric, and the occasional creak of wooden bed frames. Brother Thomas pulled on his leather sandals and made his way toward the door of the dormitory, joining the quiet procession of brown-robed figures moving through the stone corridors toward the chapel. The chapel of St. Benedict's Abbey was the heart of the monastery, a beautiful space with soaring stone arches and walls painted with simple but moving religious scenes. The early morning air was thick with the scent of beeswax candles and the faint aroma of incense from the previous evening's prayers. 28 carved wooden choir stalls faced each other across the center aisle, each one assigned to a specific monk according to his position in the community hierarchy. Brother Thomas took his place in the choir stall that had been his for the past 8 years, ever since he had been appointed as the monastery's librarian. To his left sat Brother Marcus, the infirmarian who tended to the sick. And to his right was Brother William, who oversaw the abbey's scriptorium where manuscripts were copied and illuminated. The abbot, Father Benedict, entered last and took his place at the front of the chapel, his presence commanding immediate attention despite the gentle nature of his leadership. Matins began with a simple chant, the monks' voices rising in unison to fill the stone space with ancient melodies that had been sung in monasteries across Europe for centuries. The service lasted approximately 45 minutes and consisted of psalms, readings from scripture, and periods of silent meditation. Brother Thomas found these early morning prayers to be among the most peaceful moments of his day, when his mind was clear and his heart was most open to contemplation. After matins concluded, the monks filed out of the chapel in the same orderly fashion they had entered. The next service, lauds, would begin at daybreak, but there was nearly an hour of free time before then. Some monks returned to the dormitory for additional rest, while others used this time for private prayer or meditation. Brother Thomas chose to visit the library, his particular domain within the monastery. The library of St. Benedict's Abbey was not large by the standards of some of the great monastic houses, but it contained nearly 200 volumes, an impressive collection for a monastery of their size. The books were stored on wooden shelves built into alcoves along the walls, each volume carefully wrapped in leather or cloth to protect it from moisture and dust. Many of the books had been copied by monks within their own scriptorium, while others had been acquired through donations or trade with other religious houses. Brother Thomas lit a single candle and settled at his desk, a sturdy wooden table positioned near one of the small windows. Before him lay his current project, a careful copy of St. Augustine's Confessions that he had been working on for the past 4 months. The work was painstaking, requiring perfect attention to detail and a steady hand. Each letter had to be formed precisely, each word spaced correctly, and each page laid out according to the traditional format that had been established by generations of monastic scribes. The parchment he worked on was made from sheepskin, prepared by the monastery's own craftsmen who had learned their trade from masters in nearby towns. The process of making parchment was lengthy and required considerable skill. First, the animal hide was soaked in lime water to remove all hair and flesh. Then it was stretched on wooden frames and scraped repeatedly until it reached the proper thickness and smoothness. Finally, it was treated with chalk and pumice stone to create a surface suitable for writing. Brother Thomas dipped his quill pen into the small pot of black ink beside his work area. The ink was made from oak galls mixed with iron sulfate and gum arabic, creating a permanent black color that would not fade over time. He had learned to make this ink himself during his early years in the scriptorium, grinding the oak galls by hand and mixing the ingredients in precise proportions according to recipes that had been passed down through generations of monastic scribes. As he worked on the manuscript, Brother Thomas reflected on the words he was copying. St. Augustine's account of his spiritual journey from a life of worldly pursuits to religious devotion had particular meaning for someone who had made a similar choice, though perhaps not as dramatic as the famous saint's conversion. Thomas had come to the monastery not after a life of sin and excess, but rather as a young man seeking purpose and meaning in a world that often seemed chaotic and uncertain. The first light of dawn began to filter through the small library window, casting long shadows across the wooden shelves and stone floor. Brother Thomas carefully cleaned his quill pen and closed the inkpot, then wrapped the unfinished manuscript in a clean cloth to protect it until he could return to his work later in the day. The bell for lauds would ring soon, and he wanted to spend a few moments in private prayer before joining his brothers in the chapel. He knelt before the small wooden crucifix that hung on the library wall, a simple but beautifully carved piece that had been made by Brother Francis, who had died 3 years earlier. Brother Francis had possessed remarkable skill as a woodcarver, and several of his pieces decorated various parts of the monastery. This particular crucifix had been his final work, completed just days before his death from a fever that the infirmary had been unable to cure. Brother Thomas offered prayers for Brother Francis's soul, as he did each morning, along with prayers for his own family members who lived in a village 2 days' journey from the monastery. His parents were both still living, though they were growing elderly, and his younger sister had married a blacksmith and had 3 children of her own. He had not seen them for more than 2 years, though he received occasional news through travelers who stopped at the monastery. The bell for lauds began to ring, its clear tone announcing the official beginning of the monastery's day. Brother Thomas rose from his knees and made his way back to the chapel, where his brothers were already assembling for the second of the day's 7 prayer services. The chapel was brighter now, with natural light streaming through the windows and mixing with the warm glow of candles. Lauds was a service of praise and thanksgiving, celebrating the gift of another day and asking for divine guidance in the hours ahead. The psalms sung during this service were generally more joyful than those of matins, reflecting the hope and optimism that came with the morning light. Brother Thomas particularly enjoyed the Canticle of Zachary, which spoke of God's mercy and the dawn of salvation. After lauds concluded, the monks had a brief period for personal hygiene and preparation for the day's work. The monastery's wash house contained stone basins where the monks could clean themselves with cold water and simple soap made from animal fat and ash. Personal cleanliness was considered important, not for vanity, but as a form of respect for the body as a temple of the spirit. Brother Thomas splashed cold water on his face and hands, using a rough cloth to dry himself. The water was always cold, even in summer, as it came from a deep well that the monastery's founders had dug when the community was first established. The well had never run dry, even during the driest years, which the monks considered a sign of divine blessing on their community. At 6 o'clock, the bell rang for prime, the third prayer service of the day. This was a shorter service than matins or lauds, lasting only about 20 minutes, but it served an important function in preparing the monks mentally and spiritually for their daily work. The prayers of prime often focused on asking for strength and wisdom to carry out their duties faithfully and well. Following prime, the monks filed into the refectory for their first meal of the day. The refectory was a large room with long wooden tables and benches, capable of seating all the monks comfortably. The walls were decorated with simple religious paintings depicting scenes from the life of Saint Benedict, the founder of their monastic rule. At the front of the room stood a raised platform called a pulpit, where one monk would read aloud during meals while the others ate in silence. The morning meal was simple but nourishing, consisting of bread baked in the monastery's own ovens, cheese made from milk provided by their small herd of goats, and weak ale that was safer to drink than water from most sources. During certain seasons, they might also have porridge made from oats or barley, eggs from their chickens, or fresh vegetables from their gardens. The portions were modest, in keeping with their vows of simplicity and their belief that excessive eating was a form of gluttony that should be avoided. Brother Thomas took his assigned place at one of the long tables, sitting between Brother Marcus and Brother William, as he did for every meal. The monk chosen to read that day was Brother Peter, who had a particularly clear speaking voice and excellent pronunciation. Brother Peter climbed to the pulpit and opened a large leather-bound volume to begin reading from the Rule of Saint Benedict, the foundational document that governed every aspect of their monastic life. The Rule of Saint Benedict had been written in the 6th century by the saint who founded the Benedictine order of monks. It consisted of 73 chapters that covered everything from the duties of the abbot to the proper way to receive guests, from the schedule of prayer services to the distribution of work assignments. The rule emphasized the importance of community life, obedience to authority, and the balance between prayer and work that became known as ora et labora, pray and work. As Brother Peter read from the chapter dealing with humility, Brother Thomas chewed his bread slowly and contemplated the words. Humility was considered one of the most important virtues for a monk to cultivate, involving not just modesty about one's accomplishments, but a genuine recognition of one's dependence on divine grace. The rule described 12 degrees of humility, beginning with the fear of God and progressing through various stages of self-discipline and submission to divine will. The reading continued throughout the meal, which lasted approximately 30 minutes. When all the monks had finished eating, they stood together and recited a prayer of thanksgiving for the food they had received. Brother Thomas felt genuinely grateful for the simple meal, remembering the many people in the surrounding countryside who often went hungry, especially during times of poor harvest or when traveling armies demanded provisions from local farmers. After breakfast, the monks dispersed to begin their morning work assignments. The monastery operated according to a principle that Saint Benedict had established centuries earlier, that a monastic community should be as self-sufficient as possible. This meant that the monks needed to perform all the various tasks necessary to maintain their buildings, feed themselves, and support their religious mission. Brother Thomas's primary responsibility was the care and management of the library, but like all his brothers, he also contributed to the community's general labor needs. This morning, he was assigned to work in the vegetable garden, which provided much of the fresh food for the monastery's table. The garden covered nearly 2 acres of land behind the main monastery buildings and was divided into carefully planned sections for different types of crops. The monastery's approach to agriculture was based on principles that had been refined over generations of monastic life. The monks had learned through careful observation and experimentation which crops thrived in their particular soil conditions and climate. They had developed a sophisticated understanding of crop rotation, recognizing that certain plants could restore nutrients to the soil that other plants had depleted. This knowledge had been passed down orally from one generation of gardening monks to the next, supplemented by careful written records that documented which techniques produced the best results. The soil preparation for each growing season began in late autumn, when the monks would spread composted organic matter throughout the garden plots. This compost was created from kitchen scraps, animal waste from their livestock, and plant material from the previous year's harvest. The process of creating useful compost required patience and skill, as the organic materials needed to be layered and turned regularly to ensure proper decomposition. Brother Francis had developed particular expertise in managing this process, understanding the precise balance of moisture, air, and organic materials that produced the rich, dark compost that transformed ordinary soil into highly productive growing medium. The garden's layout reflected both practical considerations and aesthetic principles that were important to the monastic worldview. Each section was carefully planned to maximize efficiency while also creating visual harmony that would inspire contemplation and appreciation for the beauty of God's creation. The paths between the planted areas were wide enough to allow monks to work comfortably, but narrow enough to conserve space for growing crops. Wooden trellises and support structures were crafted with attention to both function and appearance, creating orderly lines and geometric patterns that reflected the monastery's commitment to discipline and organization in all aspects of life. Water management was a crucial aspect of the garden's success, particularly during the drier months of summer when natural rainfall might be insufficient to sustain healthy plant growth. The monks had constructed an ingenious system of channels and reservoirs that collected rainwater from the monastery's roofs and directed it to where it was most needed. Clay pipes buried beneath the garden paths carried water to strategic locations throughout the growing areas, allowing the monks to provide irrigation efficiently without wasting this precious resource. The selection of crops grown in the monastery garden reflected both nutritional needs and practical considerations related to food preservation and storage. Root vegetables like carrots, turnips, and onions could be stored in the monastery's cool cellars throughout the winter months, providing essential nutrients when fresh produce was not available. Leafy greens like cabbage and kale could be preserved through techniques like salting and fermentation, creating food supplies that would remain edible for extended periods. Herbs occupied a special section of the garden, as they served multiple purposes in monastic life. Culinary herbs like thyme, sage, and rosemary enhanced the flavor of simple meals while also providing important nutritional benefits. Medicinal herbs were equally important, as Brother Marcus relied on plants like chamomile, lavender, and echinacea to prepare treatments for various ailments that affected the monks throughout the year. The herb garden was laid out according to traditional patterns that grouped plants according to their uses and growing requirements. The monastery also maintained a small orchard that produced apples, pears, and plums that supplemented the vegetables grown in the main garden. The fruit trees had been planted by earlier generations of monks and now provided abundant harvests that could be preserved through drying, fermentation, or storage in the monastery's cool cellars. The orchard required different kinds of care than the vegetable garden, including annual pruning, pest management, and soil care that ensured healthy growth and maximum fruit production. Beekeeping was another important aspect of the monastery's agricultural activities. The bees not only produced honey that served as the community's primary sweetener, but also provided wax that was essential for making candles and preserving written materials. The beehives were located in a quiet section of the monastery grounds where the insects could work undisturbed while still being accessible to the monks who cared for them. Brother Francis had learned the delicate art of managing bee colonies, understanding how to harvest honey without harming the bees, and how to help weak colonies survive through difficult periods. The garden was supervised by Brother Francis, not the same Brother Francis who had been the woodcarver, an elderly monk who had developed remarkable skill in agriculture during his 42 years of monastic life. Brother Francis had learned through careful observation and experimentation which crops grew best in their particular soil and climate, and he had developed techniques for extending the growing season and improving yields that were envied by farmers in the surrounding area. This morning's task involved weeding the rows of beans that had been planted 6 weeks earlier. Brother Thomas knelt beside the carefully tended rows and began the methodical process of identifying and removing unwanted plants that competed with the beans for nutrients and water. The work was repetitive and required concentration, but he found it oddly satisfying to see the neat rows of healthy plants emerging as the weeds were cleared away. As he worked, Brother Thomas reflected on the parallel between tending a garden and tending one's spiritual life. Just as weeds needed to be constantly removed from the garden to allow the desired plants to flourish, negative thoughts and temptations needed to be recognized and eliminated before they could take root in the soul. The comparison was not original to him. It had been used by countless religious teachers throughout the centuries, but the physical act of gardening made the metaphor feel particularly real and meaningful. The morning air was cool and pleasant, with a gentle breeze carrying the sense of growing plants and fresh earth. Brother Thomas could hear the sounds of his brothers working in other parts of the monastery grounds. The rhythmic thudding of an axe as someone chopped firewood, the scraping of a hoe in another section of the garden, the distant sound of hammering from the workshop where broken tools were repaired. At 9 o'clock, the bell rang for terce, the fourth prayer service of the day. Brother Thomas brushed the dirt from his hands and knees and joined the procession of monks making their way back to the chapel. Terce was traditionally associated with the descent of the Holy Spirit at Pentecost, and the prayers often focused on asking for divine inspiration and guidance in the day's work. The service was relatively brief, lasting only 15 minutes, after which the monks returned to their assigned tasks. Brother Thomas spent another hour in the garden, completing the weeding of the bean rows and helping to water the newer plantings that required daily attention. The monastery's water system was quite sophisticated for its time, involving a series of channels and cisterns that collected rainwater and directed it to where it was needed most. At 10:30, Brother Thomas returned to the library to continue his work on the manuscript of St. Augustine's Confessions. The morning light streaming through the window was now at its best angle for detailed work, providing clear illumination without casting shadows across his writing surface. He carefully unwrapped the manuscript from its protective cloth and examined the previous day's work, checking for any errors or imperfections that might need to be corrected. Copying manuscripts was more than just a mechanical process of reproducing text. Each scribe brought his own understanding and interpretation to the work, sometimes adding marginal notes that provided explanations or cross-references to other texts. Brother Thomas had been trained to remain as faithful as possible to the original text, but he was also expected to use his knowledge and judgment to correct obvious errors or to clarify passages that might be confusing to future readers. The particular manuscript he was copying had come from the library of a monastery in France, acquired through a complex exchange that had taken more than a year to arrange. Their abbot had corresponded with his counterpart at the French monastery, negotiating the loan of several texts in exchange for copies of works that the French monks needed. Such exchanges were common among monasteries, serving to spread knowledge and ensure that important texts were preserved in multiple locations. As Brother Thomas worked on copying a particularly challenging passage dealing with Augustine's theological understanding of grace and free will, he was struck by the profundity of the saint's insights. Augustine had grappled with some of the most fundamental questions of human existence: the nature of evil, the possibility of redemption, the relationship between divine sovereignty and human responsibility. These were not merely academic questions, but deeply personal struggles that Augustine had worked through in his own spiritual journey. The morning's copying session was interrupted by the bell for sect, the prayer service that marked the middle of the day. Brother Thomas carefully cleaned his pen and covered his work, then joined his brothers in the chapel for prayers that traditionally focused on perseverance and steadfastness in the face of the day's challenges. The psalms sung at sext often dealt with themes of protection and divine assistance during times of difficulty. Following sext, the monks gathered in the refectory for their main meal of the day. This meal was more substantial than the morning's simple fare, typically including soup made from vegetables grown in their own garden, bread, cheese, and sometimes fish caught in the nearby river or provided by local fishermen in exchange for the monastery's prayers and occasional assistance during harvest time. The reading during this meal came from the lives of the saints, stories of holy men and women who had lived exemplary lives of faith and service. Today's reading told the story of Saint Martin of Tours, a 4th century bishop who had been known for his generosity to the poor and his dedication to spreading Christian teaching throughout the rural areas of France. The story included the famous incident in which Martin, as a young soldier, had cut his military cloak in half to share it with a beggar, only to have a vision of Christ wearing the portion he had given away. Brother Thomas found these stories inspiring, though he sometimes wondered whether the miraculous elements had grown in the telling over the centuries. More important to him than the supernatural aspects were the examples of practical charity and selfless service that characterized the lives of these holy people. Saint Martin's willingness to give up his own comfort for the sake of someone in need was the kind of everyday heroism that any person could aspire to, regardless of whether they performed miracles. After the meal concluded with prayers of thanksgiving, the monks had a brief period of rest before resuming their afternoon work. This rest period was not considered laziness, but rather a necessary restoration that allowed them to work effectively during the afternoon hours. Some monks used this time for silent prayer or meditation, while others simply rested their bodies in preparation for the remaining tasks of the day. Brother Thomas chose to spend this rest period walking slowly through the monastery's cloister, a covered walkway that surrounded a peaceful courtyard garden. The cloister was one of his favorite places in the entire monastery, a space designed for quiet reflection and contemplation. The courtyard contained carefully tended herbs that were used both for cooking and for preparing medicines in the infirmary, as well as flowers that served no practical purpose except to provide beauty and inspire thoughts of the divine Creator's love for all living things. As he walked, Brother Thomas observed the intricate stonework of the cloister's arches and columns. Each element had been carefully planned and executed by skilled craftsmen who had understood that their work was not merely functional, but also spiritual. The proportions and decorative details followed patterns that were believed to reflect the harmony and order of divine creation. Even someone with no formal education in architecture could sense the peace and balance that the designers had achieved. The afternoon work period began at 1 o'clock, announced by the monastery's bell. Brother Thomas returned to the library, where he planned to spend the remainder of the day working on his manuscript copying. However, he first needed to attend to some of his other responsibilities as librarian, including the cataloging of a new book that had recently arrived from another monastery. The new book was a treatise on herbal medicine written by a monk who had spent decades studying the healing properties of various plants. Such practical knowledge was highly valued in monastic communities, where the infirmarian was expected to treat a wide range of ailments using natural remedies. Brother Thomas carefully examined the book's condition, noting any damage that might need repair, and then wrote a detailed description of its contents in the monastery's catalog. The catalog was itself a valuable document, containing detailed information about every book in the monastery's collection. Each entry included the title, author, subject matter, physical condition, and location of the book, as well as notes about how it had been acquired and any special restrictions on its use. Maintaining this catalog required constant attention, as books were occasionally borrowed by other monasteries, damaged by age or use, or supplemented by new acquisitions. At 2:30, the bell rang for none, the sixth prayer service of the day. Brother Thomas marked his place in the catalog work and joined his brothers in the chapel for prayers that traditionally focused on the theme of sacrifice and offering one's life in service to others. The timing of none corresponded to the traditional hour of Christ's death on the cross, making it a particularly solemn and meaningful service for the monks. After none concluded, Brother Thomas returned to his manuscript copying work. The afternoon light was beginning to fade, making the detailed work more challenging. But he had learned to position his desk and candles to maintain adequate illumination. He worked steadily for nearly 2 hours, making significant progress on a chapter that dealt with Augustine's understanding of the relationship between faith and reason. Augustine had argued that faith and reason were not opposed to each other, but rather worked together in the search for truth. This perspective had been influential in shaping medieval Christian thinking about the relationship between religious belief and philosophical inquiry. Brother Thomas found this balance appealing, as it validated both his emotional experience of faith and his intellectual curiosity about theological questions. As he copied Augustine's careful arguments, Brother Thomas reflected on his own spiritual journey and the role that both faith and reason had played in bringing him to monastic life. His decision to become a monk had not been based purely on emotional or mystical experience, though he had certainly felt a sense of divine calling. He had also thought carefully about the kind of life that would allow him to serve others most effectively and to develop his own character in positive ways. At 4:30, the bell rang for Vespers, the evening prayer service that marked the transition from the day's work to the more contemplative activities of evening. Vespers was one of the most beautiful services of the day, with longer psalms and more elaborate music than some of the shorter prayer services. The fading daylight streaming through the chapel windows created an atmosphere of peaceful reflection that Brother Thomas found deeply moving. The prayers of Vespers often focused on themes of gratitude for the day's blessings and preparation for the rest that was to come. The monks sang ancient hymns that had been passed down through generations, melodies that connected them to countless other religious communities throughout Europe and across the centuries. Brother Thomas felt a profound sense of belonging to something larger than himself when he participated in these communal prayers. Following Vespers, the monks gathered for their final meal of the day, a simple supper consisting of bread, soup, and perhaps some fruit from the monastery's orchard when it was in season. The reading during supper came from the writings of early Christian monks who had lived as hermits in the deserts of Egypt and Syria. These stories of extreme asceticism and spiritual discipline provided both inspiration and perspective for the monks of St. Benedict's Abbey who lived a more moderate form of religious life. The monastery's approach to food and dining reflected careful attention to both spiritual and practical considerations. The rule of Saint Benedict emphasized the importance of moderation in all things, including the consumption of food and drink. Meals were designed to provide adequate nutrition for the demanding physical and intellectual work that the monks performed, while avoiding the excess that might lead to gluttony or distraction from spiritual concerns. The monastery's kitchen was a well-organized operation that served nearly 30 people 3 times each day throughout the year. The cooking facilities included large stone ovens that were heated with wood fires, iron cauldrons for preparing soups and stews, and various specialized tools for food preparation and preservation. Brother Joseph, who served as the monastery's cook, had developed considerable skill in creating nutritious and palatable meals using the simple ingredients that were available to the community. Bread was the foundation of most monastic meals, and its production required daily attention throughout the year. The monastery maintained its own grain storage facilities and milling equipment, allowing the monks to control the quality and freshness of their bread supply. The process of bread making began before dawn each day, when Brother Joseph and his assistants would prepare the dough using flour, water, salt, and yeast that was carefully maintained from one batch to the next. The monastery's ovens were large enough to bake sufficient bread for the entire community, but they required careful management to maintain proper temperatures and ensure even baking. The fires needed to be started several hours before baking could begin, and the temperature had to be monitored constantly to avoid burning the bread or leaving it undercooked. Brother Joseph had developed an almost intuitive sense for when the ovens had reached the optimal temperature for different types of baking. In addition to daily bread, the kitchen staff prepared various types of preserved foods that would remain edible throughout the winter months when fresh ingredients were not available. These preservation techniques included smoking meats and fish, fermenting vegetables, drying fruits and herbs, and preparing various types of pickled foods that would provide essential nutrients during the coldest parts of the year. The monastery maintained a small but productive dairy operation that provided milk, cheese, and butter for the community's meals. A herd of 8 goats and 4 cows required daily care and attention, but they produced enough dairy products to meet most of the monastery's needs. The animals were housed in a sturdy stone barn that protected them from harsh weather while providing adequate ventilation and space for comfortable living. Brother Andrew, who supervised the monastery's livestock, had learned through years of experience how to maintain healthy animals that produced consistently good quantities of milk. This knowledge included understanding the nutritional needs of different types of animals, recognizing signs of illness or injury that required treatment, and managing breeding programs that ensured a continuing supply of productive animals. The process of making cheese required considerable skill and timing, as the transformation of milk into cheese depended on precise control of temperature, timing, and bacterial cultures that caused the necessary chemical changes. The monastery produced several different types of cheese, ranging from soft, fresh varieties that were consumed within a few days of production, to hard, aged cheeses that could be stored for months without spoiling. The monastery's cellar provided ideal conditions for aging cheese and storing other preserved foods. The temperature remained relatively constant throughout the year, and the humidity levels were naturally regulated by the stone construction and underground location. Wooden shelves and storage containers allowed the monks to organize their food supplies efficiently while protecting them from rodents and other pests that might cause contamination or waste. Wine production was another important aspect of the monastery's food preparation activities. While the monks consumed wine primarily for its nutritional value and because it was safer to drink than water from many sources, the process of making wine also provided them with valuable skills in fermentation and preservation. The monastery maintained a small vineyard that produced grapes suitable for making wine, though they also acquired additional grapes from local farmers during years when their own harvest was insufficient. The winemaking process began with the careful selection and crushing of ripe grapes, followed by fermentation in large wooden vats that were maintained exclusively for this purpose. The fermentation process required careful monitoring and occasional intervention to ensure that the wine developed properly without spoiling or developing undesirable flavors. Brother Thomas had assisted with wine production during his early years at the monastery, learning the subtle art of determining when fermentation was complete and the wine was ready for storage. The monastery's approach to meal planning reflected their understanding of the relationship between physical health and spiritual well-being. Meals were designed to provide adequate nutrition without encouraging overindulgence, and the timing of meals was carefully coordinated with the schedule of prayer services and work activities. The practice of eating in silence while listening to spiritual readings was intended to nourish the soul as well as the body, transforming simple meals into opportunities for contemplation and spiritual growth. Food preparation and service were considered forms of community service that were just as important as more obviously spiritual activities like prayer and manuscript copying. The monks who worked in the kitchen and dining areas understood that their efforts contributed directly to the well-being of their brothers and to the overall mission of the monastery. This perspective transformed routine tasks like cooking and cleaning into opportunities for spiritual development and service to others. The monastery's gardens and food production activities also served educational purposes, particularly for younger monks who were learning the practical skills necessary for monastic life. New members of the community spent time working in various aspects of food production, gaining appreciation for the work required to sustain their community, while also learning valuable skills that would serve them throughout their lives in the monastery. Brother Thomas sometimes found these Desert Fathers' stories almost unbelievable in their accounts of severe self-denial and supernatural experiences. Some of the hermit monks were said to have lived for decades eating nothing but bread and water, or to have spent years without speaking to another human being. While he respected their dedication, Brother Thomas was grateful for the more balanced approach to monastic life that Saint Benedict had established, which emphasized community life and reasonable moderation in all things. After supper concluded, the monks had a period of free time before the final prayer service of the day. This was traditionally a time for reading, meditation, or quiet conversation with other members of the community. Brother Thomas chose to visit Brother Marcus in the infirmary, where the elderly monk was caring for Brother Luke, who had developed a persistent cough that had kept him from participating in some of the day's activities. The infirmary was a clean, well-organized space with several beds for monks who needed extended care, as well as shelves lined with various herbal remedies and medical supplies. Brother Marcus had learned his healing skills through years of experience and study, consulting books on medicine and corresponding with physicians in nearby towns to stay current with the best available treatments. Brother Luke's cough had begun 3 weeks earlier and had gradually worsened despite various treatments. Brother Marcus had tried several different herbal preparations, including teas made from horehound and coltsfoot, steam treatments with aromatic herbs, and poultices applied to the chest. The patient was showing some improvement, but recovery was slow, and Brother Marcus was concerned about the possibility of the illness spreading to other members of the community. Brother Thomas spent a few minutes talking quietly with Brother Luke, who was grateful for the company and the distraction from his discomfort. They discussed the manuscript copying project and some of the theological questions that Augustine had raised in his writings. Brother Luke had been a scholar before joining the monastery and enjoyed intellectual discussions even when he was not feeling well. At 7 o'clock, the bell rang for Compline, the final prayer service of the day. This was perhaps the most peaceful and contemplative of all the services, designed to prepare the monks for sleep and to entrust their souls to divine protection during the night hours. The chapel was lit only by candles, creating an atmosphere of quiet intimacy that encouraged deep reflection and prayer. The prayers of Compline included the ancient hymn Te lucis ante terminum, before the ending of the light, which asked for protection from the dangers and temptations that might come during the night. The service also included the Canticle of Simeon, the song of the old man who had seen the infant Jesus in the temple and proclaimed that he could now depart in peace, having seen God's salvation. After Compline concluded, the monks observed what was called the Great Silence, a period that lasted until the morning prayers, when no conversation was permitted, except in cases of genuine emergency. This silence was designed to create an atmosphere of peace and contemplation that would carry over into the night's rest and prepare the mind for the following day's spiritual activities. Brother Thomas returned to the dormitory with his brothers, moving quietly through the stone corridors that were now lit only by occasional candles. He performed his simple evening preparations for sleep, hanging his habit on its wooden peg and arranging his few personal possessions in their proper places. He knelt beside his bed for several minutes of private prayer, offering thanks for the day's experiences and asking for guidance and strength for the challenges that tomorrow might bring. As he lay in his narrow bed, Brother Thomas reflected on the day that had just ended. It had been, in many ways, a perfectly ordinary day in the life of the monastery. No dramatic events, no crises or celebrations, just the steady rhythm of prayer, work, and community life that had shaped his existence for the past 16 years. Yet he felt a deep sense of satisfaction and fulfillment that came from living according to a clear set of values and priorities. The monastery bell tower stood silent now against the night sky, its bronze bell waiting to announce the beginning of another day in a few hours. In the dormitory, 28 monks settled into sleep, their breathing gradually synchronizing into the peaceful rhythm of a community at rest. Outside the monastery walls, the medieval world continued its often chaotic and unpredictable course, but within these stone walls, a small group of men had created an island of stability and purpose that would endure for centuries to come. Brother Thomas closed his eyes and allowed the familiar sounds of the monastery at night to wash over him. The distant hooting of an owl, the soft rustle of wind through the trees in the courtyard, the barely audible breathing of his sleeping brothers. These sounds had become as much a part of his life as the daily prayers and the taste of simple food shared in community. He offered a final prayer of gratitude for the gift of this calling and the opportunity to serve something greater than himself. Sleep came gradually, as it did each night, bringing rest to a body that had worked faithfully and a mind that had been occupied with worthwhile thoughts throughout the day. In a few hours, the bell would ring again, and the cycle would begin anew. Matins, lauds, prime, work, terce, more work, sext, the main meal, nun, vespers, supper, compline, and the great silence. It was a rhythm as reliable as the seasons, as comforting as a mother's lullaby, and as meaningful as any life that had ever been lived in service to the divine. The weeks and months that followed this particular day brought their own variations and challenges to the life of St. Benedict's Abbey. Spring turned to summer, with longer days that allowed more time for outdoor work and the harvest of early vegetables from the garden. Brother Thomas continued his patient work on the manuscript of St. Augustine's Confessions, making steady progress through the saint's complex theological reflections and personal insights. The changing seasons brought distinct rhythms to monastic life that connected the community to the natural world and reminded them of their dependence on divine providence. Spring was a time of renewal and hope, when the gardens came back to life after the dormancy of winter, and the monastery's buildings could be opened to fresh air and sunshine. The monks eagerly anticipated the first fresh vegetables of the season, which provided welcome variety after months of preserved foods. Summer brought its own joys and challenges, with longer days that extended the time available for outdoor work, but also created demands for additional labor in the gardens and orchards. The monastery's water system required constant attention during dry spells, and the monks worked together to ensure that their crops received adequate irrigation. The longer daylight hours also meant adjustments to the schedule of prayer services, as the times of sunrise and sunset shifted throughout the season. The monastery's workshop activities expanded during the warmer months, when repairs and construction projects that had been delayed during winter could be resumed. Brother Paul, who served as the community's primary carpenter and mason, supervised projects that ranged from routine maintenance of buildings and equipment to major improvements that would serve the monastery for decades to come. These projects provided opportunities for younger monks to learn valuable construction skills while contributing to their community's long-term welfare. The workshop contained an impressive array of tools and equipment that allowed the monks to perform most of the construction and repair work needed to maintain their facilities. Woodworking tools included saws, chisels, planes, and measuring devices that enabled skilled craftsmen to create everything from simple furniture to complex architectural elements. Stoneworking tools allowed for repairs to the monastery's walls and buildings, while metalworking equipment enabled the creation and maintenance of tools, hardware, and other essential items. Brother Paul had learned his construction skills through years of apprenticeship with master craftsmen before joining the monastery, and he had continued to develop his abilities through decades of practical experience in maintaining and improving the abbey's facilities. His expertise encompassed not only technical skills, but also an understanding of architectural principles that ensured structural integrity and aesthetic appeal in all of his projects. The monastery's buildings had been constructed according to plans that reflected both practical needs and spiritual symbolism important to monastic life. The arrangement of structures around the central cloister created a sense of enclosure and separation from the outside world, while providing efficient circulation between different areas of the complex. The proportions and decorative elements followed traditional patterns that were believed to reflect divine harmony and order. The church itself was the architectural centerpiece of the monastery, designed to inspire reverence and contemplation while accommodating the community's liturgical needs. The stone walls rose to considerable height, creating an interior space that seemed to lift the thoughts and prayers of the monks toward heaven. Carefully planned windows provided adequate light for reading and prayer, while creating patterns of illumination that changed throughout the day as the sun moved across the sky. The acoustic properties of the church had been carefully considered during its construction, creating an interior environment that enhanced the beauty of chanted prayers and hymns. The stone walls and vaulted ceiling reflected sound in ways that enriched the monks' voices without creating confusing echoes that would interfere with clear communication. Brother Thomas particularly appreciated how the architecture seemed to transform their simple human voices into something that suggested the harmony of angelic choirs. The monastery's defensive capabilities reflected the practical realities of medieval life, when religious communities needed to protect themselves from various threats, including bandits, local conflicts, and occasional invasions by hostile armies. The walls surrounding the monastery grounds were substantial enough to deter casual intruders, while providing secure storage for valuable items like manuscripts, religious artifacts, and food supplies that might attract unwanted attention. However, the defensive features were designed to be unobtrusive and compatible with the monastery's primary mission of prayer and scholarship. The walls included architectural elements that served both protective and aesthetic functions, creating barriers that provided security without making the monastery appear forbidding or unwelcoming to legitimate visitors and pilgrims. The main gate was particularly well designed, featuring heavy wooden doors reinforced with iron fittings that could be securely barred from the inside during times of danger. The gatehouse included living quarters for the porter, who was responsible for screening visitors and ensuring that only appropriate people gained access to the monastery's interior spaces. The design also included features that allowed defenders to observe and communicate with people outside the walls without exposing themselves to unnecessary risk. During peaceful times, the monastery's defensive features were barely noticeable, but they provided reassurance to the monks and practical protection for their community's valuable possessions and activities. The combination of spiritual dedication and practical preparedness reflected the balanced approach to life that characterized Benedictine monasticism. The monastery's relationship with the surrounding secular community was complex and multifaceted, involving economic, social, and spiritual connections that benefited both the religious and lay populations. Local farmers and craftsmen often brought their products to the monastery for trade, exchanging food, materials, and services for the prayers, education, and specialized skills that the monks could provide. These economic relationships were governed by principles of fairness and mutual benefit that reflected the monastery's commitment to justice and charity. The monks were careful to pay fair prices for goods and services they needed, while also providing valuable assistance to their neighbors during times of crisis or special need. This approach created bonds of trust and cooperation that served both communities well over the years. The monastery also served important social functions in the surrounding region, providing education for young people, medical care for the sick and injured, and spiritual guidance for people facing various challenges in their lives. Brother Marcus's medical knowledge was particularly valuable to local residents who had limited access to other forms of healthcare, and his willingness to share his expertise strengthened the monastery's reputation and relationships with neighboring communities. The educational services provided by the monastery included basic literacy instruction for children and adults, as well as more advanced learning opportunities for those who showed particular aptitude or interest. Brother Thomas occasionally taught reading and writing to young people from nearby families, finding these interactions both challenging and rewarding as he worked to pass on the knowledge and skills that would serve them throughout their lives. The monastery's role as a center of learning extended beyond formal instruction to include the preservation and transmission of knowledge through manuscript copying and scholarly research. The books produced in their scriptorium were valued throughout the region and sometimes traveled considerable distances to reach other monasteries, cathedral schools, and private collectors who appreciated high-quality scholarship and craftsmanship. These scholarly activities connected the monastery to intellectual networks that spanned much of Europe, creating relationships with other centers of learning that enriched their own understanding while also contributing to the broader development of medieval scholarship. Letters and manuscripts flowed regularly between St. Benedict's Abbey and other institutions, carrying new ideas and information that kept the monks current with developments in theology, philosophy, science, and other fields of study. During the summer months, the monastery received more visitors than usual, as the warmer weather made travel easier and safer. Some visitors were pilgrims on their way to important religious sites, seeking prayers and blessings for their journeys. Others were merchants or craftsmen who had business in the area and appreciated the monastery's reputation for hospitality and fair dealing. The rule of Saint Benedict required that all guests be received as if they were Christ himself, and the monks took this obligation seriously. Brother Thomas often assisted with the care of guests, as his education and gentle manner made him effective at making visitors feel welcome while also representing the monastery's values and mission. He enjoyed these interactions with people from the outside world, as they provided opportunities to learn about conditions in distant places and to share something of the peace and wisdom that monastic life had taught him. One particularly memorable visitor was a young man named Robert, the son of a wealthy merchant who was considering whether to pursue a religious vocation. Robert spent 3 days at the monastery, participating in the daily prayers and observing the community's way of life. Brother Thomas was assigned to serve as his guide and to answer his questions about monastic life. Robert was intelligent and sincere, but he had grown up in comfort and luxury that made the monastery's simple lifestyle seem almost impossibly austere. He struggled with the early morning prayers, found the food bland and insufficient, and was overwhelmed by the amount of physical labor that the monks performed each day. Brother Thomas remembered his own adjustment period 16 years earlier and tried to help Robert understand that these apparent hardships were actually sources of freedom and spiritual growth. The conversations with Robert caused Brother Thomas to reflect more deeply on his own calling and the choices he had made as a young man. He had not come to the monastery to escape from worldly responsibilities, as some people assumed, but rather to take on a different and more demanding set of responsibilities. The discipline of monastic life required constant attention to spiritual and moral development, along with practical skills that contributed to the community's welfare. After Robert departed, Brother Thomas never learned whether the young man had ultimately chosen to enter religious life, but he hoped that the visit had at least given Robert a better understanding of what such a commitment would involve. Not everyone was called to monastic life, and it was important for people to make such decisions based on realistic expectations rather than romantic notions about the simplicity of religious community. As autumn approached, the monastery's pace of work intensified, with the need to harvest crops and preserve food for the coming winter. Brother Thomas spent many hours working alongside his brothers to gather apples from the orchard, preserve vegetables through drying and salting, and prepare the monastery's buildings for the cold months ahead. These seasonal rhythms connected the community to the natural world and reminded them of their dependence on divine providence for their daily sustenance. The library work continued even during the busy harvest season, though at a somewhat reduced pace. Brother Thomas completed his copy of Augustine's Confessions in early October, achievement that brought him considerable satisfaction after months of careful work. The finished manuscript was a beautiful piece of craftsmanship with clear lettering, even margins, and decorated initial letters that he had learned to create during his years in the scriptorium. Winter brought its own challenges and rewards to monastic life. The shortened days meant less time for outdoor work, but more opportunity for reading, study, and contemplation. The monastery's library became even more important during these months, as the monks had additional time to study the texts that formed the foundation of their intellectual and spiritual life. Brother Thomas began a new copying project during the winter months, this time working on a collection of sermons by St. John Chrysostom, the 4th century Archbishop of Constantinople, who was known for his eloquent preaching and his commitment to social justice. The sermons dealt with practical questions of Christian living, including the proper use of wealth, the treatment of the poor, and the responsibilities of those in positions of authority. As he copied these ancient sermons, Brother Thomas was struck by how relevant they remained to the challenges of his own time. The basic questions of how to live a moral life in an imperfect world were as pressing in the 13th century as they had been in the 4th, and the wisdom of earlier generations of Christian teachers continued to provide guidance for contemporary struggles. The winter also brought periods of illness to the monastery, as the cold weather and close living conditions made it easy for ailments to spread from one monk to another. Brother Marcus worked tirelessly in the infirmary, treating cases of fever, cough, and other seasonal complaints with his herbal remedies and careful nursing. Several of the older monks required extended care, and the entire community rallied to provide additional support for those who were suffering. Brother Luke's persistent cough finally resolved completely during the coldest part of winter, much to everyone's relief. His recovery was gradual but steady, and by spring he was able to resume his full participation in the community's work and worship. Brother Marcus attributed the healing to a combination of herbal treatments, rest, improved nutrition, and the power of communal prayer, acknowledging that medical knowledge had its limitations and that ultimate healing came from divine grace. Spring's return brought renewal and hope to the monastery, as it did to the surrounding countryside. The garden began to show signs of new growth. The days grew longer and warmer, and the monks resumed the outdoor projects that had been suspended during the winter months. Brother Thomas felt his own spirits lift with the changing season, as the promise of new life in the natural world reminded him of the spiritual renewal that was always possible through faith and commitment. The copying of John Chrysostom's sermons was completed in late spring, adding another valuable volume to the monastery's growing collection. Brother Thomas had particularly enjoyed working with these texts, as Chrysostom's direct and practical approach to Christian teaching resonated with his own understanding of how faith should be lived out in daily life. As his second decade at the monastery drew to a close, Brother Thomas found himself being consulted more frequently by younger monks who were struggling with various aspects of monastic life. His experience as librarian had given him extensive knowledge of the spiritual writings that formed the foundation of their community's wisdom, and his gentle nature made him an effective counselor and guide. One young monk, Brother David, had entered the monastery only 6 months earlier and was having difficulty adjusting to the demanding schedule of prayer and work. He had come from a farming family and was accustomed to hard physical labor, but the intellectual demands of monastic life were challenging for someone with limited formal education. Brother Thomas spent many hours working with Brother David, helping him learn to read more effectively and explaining the theological concepts that appeared in their daily readings. The work with Brother David reminded Brother Thomas of his own early struggles with certain aspects of monastic life, particularly the requirement to maintain silence during specific periods of the day. As a young man accustomed to conversation and social interaction, he had found the enforced quiet periods almost unbearably lonely at first. Only gradually had he come to understand that this silence was not meant to isolate the monks from each other, but rather to create space for deeper reflection and communion with the divine. Summer brought another season of intensive agricultural work, as the monastery's gardens and orchards required constant attention during the growing season. Brother Thomas continued to divide his time between library duties and general community labor, finding that the physical work actually enhanced his appreciation for the intellectual activities that occupied much of his time. The rhythm of manual labor provided a different kind of satisfaction from scholarly work, engaging different parts of his mind and body in the service of the community's needs. The monastery's beehives were particularly productive that summer, yielding an abundance of honey that could be used for both food and medicine. Brother Francis, the elderly monk who supervised the gardens, had also become expert in beekeeping over the years, and he taught several of the younger monks the skills needed to manage the hives safely and effectively. Brother Thomas learned to approach the bees calmly and confidently, marveling at the complex social organization of these tiny creatures that worked together so harmoniously for the benefit of their community. The parallel between the beehive and the monastery was obvious, but not simplistic. Like the bees, the monks had organized their lives around a common purpose that transcended individual desires and ambitions. Each member of the community had specific roles and responsibilities that contributed to the welfare of the whole, and the success of their shared enterprise depended on everyone fulfilling their duties faithfully and competently. As autumn arrived again, Brother Thomas was appointed to serve as the monastery's guest master, a role that involved overseeing the care and accommodation of visitors. This new responsibility required him to develop skills in hospitality and diplomacy that complemented his scholarly abilities, and he found the work both challenging and rewarding. The guest quarters were located in a separate building connected to the main monastery by a covered walkway, allowing visitors to participate in community prayers while maintaining appropriate separation from the monks' private living areas. The flow of visitors during his first year as guest master was both varied and educational. Pilgrims continued to arrive regularly, some traveling great distances to visit holy sites or to seek spiritual guidance. Many were people of modest means who had saved for years to make their pilgrimages, and Brother Thomas was moved by their devotion and determination. He made sure that these humble travelers received the same quality of care and attention as wealthy benefactors or important church officials. One group of visitors that autumn included a delegation from a monastery in Germany that was considering adopting some of the agricultural techniques that St. Benedict's Abbey had developed. The German monks spent 2 weeks observing the daily operations of the gardens, orchards, and livestock areas, taking detailed notes and asking numerous questions about methods and materials. Brother Francis served as their primary guide, but Brother Thomas assisted with translation and documentation as he was one of the few monks in the community who could read and write in both Latin and the Germanic dialects. The exchange with the German monastery led to an ongoing correspondence that enriched both communities. The German monks shared information about their own innovations in manuscript preservation and their methods for training young monks in various practical skills. This kind of inter-monastery cooperation was common throughout Europe, creating networks of shared knowledge and mutual support that strengthened the entire monastic movement. Winter brought a different rhythm to the work of guestmaster, as fewer people traveled during the coldest months. However, this provided Brother Thomas with more time to focus on improving the guest facilities and planning for the busier seasons ahead. He worked with the monastery's craftsmen to repair and upgrade furniture in the guest quarters, and he developed more systematic procedures for managing reservations and coordinating meals for visitors. The reduced guest load also allowed Brother Thomas to return more time to his scholarly work in the library. He began a new copying project that winter, working on a commentary on the Gospel of Matthew written by St. Jerome in the 4th century. Jerome's scholarly approach to biblical interpretation appealed to Brother Thomas, as it combined careful attention to the original languages and historical context with practical application to Christian living. Jerome had been one of the great scholars of the early church, responsible for translating the Bible into Latin and for writing extensive commentaries that helped later generations understand the meaning and significance of Scripture. His work on Matthew's Gospel was particularly valuable because it addressed many of the questions that ordinary Christians asked about Jesus' teachings and their relevance to daily life. As he copied Jerome's careful analysis of the Sermon on the Mount, Brother Thomas reflected on how these ancient teachings continued to challenge and inspire people in his own time. The call to love one's enemies, to give generously to those in need, and to seek first the kingdom of heaven rather than worldly success were no easier to follow in the 13th century than they had been in the 1st century. Yet they remained the foundation of Christian moral teaching. The monastery's routine was interrupted that winter by news of political upheaval in the surrounding region. A dispute between local nobles had escalated into armed conflict, and there were concerns about how this might affect the safety of the monastery and its ability to maintain normal operations. The abbot called the community together to discuss the situation and to pray for peace and reconciliation among the warring parties. Such political disturbances were unfortunately common in the medieval world, where competing claims to land and authority frequently led to violence that affected not only the combatants, but also innocent civilians who happened to live in disputed territories. The monastery's location made it relatively safe from direct military action, but economic disruptions and social instability in the surrounding region could still impact their ability to obtain necessary supplies and maintain their normal relationships with local communities. The abbot's response to this crisis reflected the wisdom he had gained through years of leadership and his deep understanding of both human nature and divine providence. Rather than allowing fear or anxiety to dominate the community's response, he emphasized the importance of maintaining their regular spiritual practices while also taking reasonable precautions to protect themselves and their valuable possessions. This balanced approach helped the monks continue their essential work while also acknowledging the realities of the situation they faced. The monastery's response to political instability also demonstrated their commitment to serving as a source of stability and hope during difficult times. They increased their prayers for peace and justice, opened their doors to refugees seeking sanctuary, and continued their charitable works even when resources were stretched thin. This dedication to their mission during challenging circumstances strengthened their reputation and relationships with people throughout the region. The conflict created opportunities for the monastery to demonstrate practical Christian charity in ways that had lasting impact on both the monks and the people they served. When a group of displaced families arrived seeking temporary shelter, the community reorganized their living arrangements to accommodate as many people as possible. The monks shared their food supplies, provided basic medical care for those who needed it, and offered comfort and counseling to people who had lost homes, possessions, and loved ones to the violence. These experiences of caring for refugees deepened the monks' understanding of human suffering and their appreciation for the security and stability that their monastic life usually provided. Brother Thomas found himself spending considerable time listening to stories of loss and hardship that gave him new perspective on the value of peace and the importance of institutions that could provide sanctuary during times of crisis. The presence of refugees in the monastery also created logistical challenges that required creative solutions and increased cooperation among all members of the community. The kitchen staff worked longer hours to feed additional people, while other monks took on extra duties related to housing, sanitation, and coordination of activities. These increased demands on their time and resources tested the community's commitment to hospitality while also providing opportunities for spiritual growth through service to others. Brother Marcus found his medical skills in particularly high demand during this period, as many of the refugees had suffered injuries or developed illnesses related to their difficult circumstances. He worked tirelessly to provide care for everyone who needed it, often continuing his duties long into the night when emergencies arose. His dedication during this crisis enhanced his reputation throughout the region and strengthened the monastery's relationships with local communities.
The educational activities of the monastery also expanded during this period, as many of the refugee families included children who had been forced to interrupt their schooling due to the conflict.
Brother Thomas and other educated monks organized informal classes that helped these young people continue their learning despite the disruption to their normal lives. These educational efforts not only served immediate practical needs, but also planted seeds of knowledge and aspiration that would serve these children throughout their lives. The monastery's chapel became a focal point for community prayers that included both monks and refugees, creating a sense of shared purpose and mutual support that transcended the differences in their backgrounds and circumstances. The regular prayer services took on enhanced meaning during this difficult period, as people who had experienced loss and uncertainty found comfort in ancient words and rituals that spoke to universal human needs for hope, meaning, and connection with the divine. The conflict was eventually resolved through negotiations between the competing parties, but the experience of hosting refugees and serving as a sanctuary during dangerous times had lasting effects on the monastery's understanding of its mission and its relationships with the broader community. The monks had demonstrated their commitment to Christian charity in practical ways that strengthened their reputation and created bonds of gratitude and respect that would endure for generations. The departure of the refugees marked the return to normal routines, but the monastery had been changed by the experience of serving others during their time of greatest need. The monks had gained new appreciation for their own blessings while also developing enhanced skills in hospitality, medical care, education, and crisis management that would serve them well in future challenges. The winter months following the resolution of the political conflict were marked by reflection on the lessons learned during this difficult period. The abbot led discussions about how the experience had affected individual monks and the community as a whole, helping everyone process their thoughts and feelings about what they had witnessed and accomplished. These conversations deepened the community's understanding of their calling, while also preparing them for similar challenges that might arise in the future. Brother Thomas found that his work on the Gospel of John commentary was enriched by his recent experiences of seeing Christian charity in action during times of crisis. The theoretical discussions of love, service, and sacrifice that appeared in John's Gospel took on new meaning when he had witnessed firsthand how these principles could be lived out in practical ways during difficult circumstances. His writing became more vivid and compelling as he drew upon concrete examples of faith in action. The manuscript copying work that had been temporarily reduced during the refugee crisis resumed its normal pace as the monastery returned to its regular routines. However, the experience had generated ideas for new projects that would serve the broader Christian community, including the creation of practical guides for establishing and managing refugee assistance programs that other monasteries could use during future emergencies. The monastery's reputation for effective crisis response and charitable service spread throughout the region, leading to requests for advice and assistance from other religious communities that were preparing for similar challenges. Brother Thomas found himself corresponding with monasteries throughout Europe, sharing practical knowledge about refugee care while also learning from the experiences of other communities that had faced comparable situations. These expanded relationships with other monasteries enriched the intellectual and spiritual life of St. Benedict's Abbey, while also contributing to the development of more effective approaches to Christian charity and service. The exchange of ideas and techniques created networks of cooperation that strengthened the entire monastic movement and enhanced its ability to serve human needs during difficult periods. Brother Thomas had experienced similar periods of regional instability during his years at the monastery, and he had learned that the best response was usually to maintain their normal routine while taking reasonable precautions for security. The monastery's walls provided some protection, but more importantly, their reputation for neutrality and charitable works had generally kept them safe even during times of political turmoil. The conflict was resolved more quickly than many had feared, and by spring, the region had returned to relative stability. However, the episode served as a reminder that the monastery's peaceful existence depended partly on circumstances beyond their control, and that their calling to serve others was particularly important during times of social disruption and human suffering. Spring brought new challenges and opportunities to Brother Thomas's work as guest master. A group of scholars from the cathedral school at Paris requested permission to visit the library and consult some of the rare manuscripts in the monastery's collection. These were not ordinary pilgrims or casual visitors, but serious academics whose research required access to texts that were available in only a few locations throughout Europe. Accommodating these scholarly visitors required careful planning and coordination. The manuscripts they wished to study were among the monastery's most valuable possessions, requiring special handling and security measures. Brother Thomas worked with the librarian and the abbot to develop protocols that would allow the scholars access to the materials they needed while protecting the books from damage or theft. The visit by the Parisian scholars was successful and mutually beneficial. The visitors were able to complete their research and expressed gratitude for the monastery's hospitality and cooperation. In return, they shared information about new developments in theology and philosophy that were being discussed in the universities, helping to keep the monastery's intellectual life current with broader scholarly trends. The success of this scholarly visit led to other similar requests, and Brother Thomas found himself developing expertise in what would later be called academic hospitality. He learned to assess the credentials and intentions of visiting scholars, to arrange appropriate accommodations and working conditions, and to facilitate productive interactions between visitors and the monastery's own learned monks. As summer arrived, Brother Thomas reflected on the changes that had occurred in his life and responsibilities over the past year. The role of guest master had expanded his understanding of the monastery's mission and had given him new skills in administration and diplomacy. He had also gained a deeper appreciation for the ways in which their community was connected to the broader world of medieval Christianity. The summer's agricultural work proceeded smoothly, with good weather producing abundant harvests in both the vegetable gardens and the orchard. Brother Thomas continued to participate in the physical labor that was expected of all community members, finding that the outdoor work provided a healthy balance to his administrative and scholarly responsibilities. The routine of manual labor remained one of his favorite aspects of monastic life, offering opportunities for meditation and reflection that complemented the more formal prayer services.
That summer also brought news that the monastery had been selected to receive a significant donation of books from the estate of a recently deceased bishop. The collection included nearly 50 volumes covering theology, philosophy, history, and practical subjects like medicine and agriculture.
Brother Thomas was appointed to lead a small delegation that would travel to the bishop's former residence to examine the books and arrange for their transport to St. Benedict's Abbey. The journey to collect the donated books was Brother Thomas's first extended trip away from the monastery in more than 5 years. Traveling with Brother William and 2 lay brothers who would help with the physical work of packing and transporting the volumes, he found himself both excited about the opportunity and somewhat anxious about leaving the familiar routines of monastic life. The bishop's residence was located 3 days' journey from the monastery, in a larger town that served as an important center for church administration and secular government. Brother Thomas was struck by the contrast between the busy, sometimes chaotic atmosphere of the town and the peaceful, ordered environment of the monastery. The sounds of merchants hawking their wares, the sight of crowds of people pursuing various business activities, and the general sense of urgency that pervaded urban life felt almost overwhelming after years of monastic quiet. The examination of the donated books revealed treasures that exceeded their expectations. The collection included several rare works that existed in only a few copies throughout Europe, as well as more common texts that would supplement and strengthen the monastery's existing holdings. Brother Thomas spent 2 full days carefully cataloging each volume, noting its condition and estimating the time and materials that would be required to repair any damage. Among the most valuable items in the collection was a beautifully illuminated psalter that had been created by monks in Ireland during the 7th century. The book's pages contained intricate decorative designs that combined Christian symbols with traditional Celtic artistic motifs, creating a visual feast that was both spiritually inspiring and aesthetically magnificent. Brother Thomas had seen few examples of such sophisticated manuscript illumination, and he spent considerable time studying the techniques that the ancient scribes had used. The return journey to the monastery required careful planning to protect the valuable books from damage during transport. The volumes were wrapped in oiled cloth and packed in sturdy wooden boxes that could be loaded onto ox carts for the 3-day trip. Brother Thomas rode alongside the carts, frequently checking to ensure that the precious cargo remained secure and dry despite the rough roads and occasional rain showers. Arriving back at St. Benedict's Abbey with the donated collection felt like returning home after a long absence, even though the trip had lasted only a week. Brother Thomas was grateful for the opportunity to travel and to see something of the wider world, but he was even more grateful to resume the familiar patterns of monastic life that had shaped and sustained him for so many years. The integration of the new books into the monastery's library required several weeks of careful work. Each volume needed to be examined for damage and treated if necessary, then properly cataloged and assigned an appropriate location on the shelves. Brother Thomas enlisted the help of several other monks who had experience with manuscript care, and together they processed the entire collection systematically and thoroughly. The arrival of so many new books generated considerable excitement throughout the monastery community. Monks who specialized in various subjects were eager to explore the new resources that were now available to them, and several requested permission to begin new research projects based on texts they had not previously had access to. The abbot granted most of these requests, recognizing that scholarly work was an important part of the monastery's mission and service to the broader church. Brother Thomas decided to begin his own new project that autumn, working on a comprehensive index to the monastery's expanded collection that would make it easier for future scholars to locate materials on specific topics. This was an ambitious undertaking that would require him to read or at least carefully examine every book in the library, but he believed that the resulting reference tool would serve the community for generations to come. The Index Project became Brother Thomas's primary scholarly focus for the next 2 years. He developed a systematic approach that involved reading each book, identifying its main themes and topics, and creating detailed cross-references that would guide readers to related materials. The work required not only careful attention to detail, but also broad knowledge of theology, philosophy, history, and other subjects that would allow him to recognize connections and relationships among different texts. As he worked through the expanded collection, Brother Thomas was struck by the continuity of human concerns and aspirations across the centuries. The questions that had troubled Augustine in the 4th century were remarkably similar to those that engaged contemporary scholars. The practical advice about Christian living that appeared in the writings of early church fathers remained relevant and helpful for people trying to live faithful lives in the 13th century. The Index Project also deepened Brother Thomas's appreciation for the community of scholars that extended far beyond the walls of any single monastery. The books in their collection represented the work of hundreds of authors from many different places and times, all united by their commitment to understanding and expressing truth about the most important questions of human existence. Each manuscript was a link in an intellectual chain that stretched back to the earliest Christian writers and forward to future generations of seekers and scholars. Winter brought a temporary slowdown in the index work, as Brother Thomas needed to devote more time to his responsibilities as guest master and to general community needs during the coldest months. However, the reduced pace actually allowed him to reflect more deeply on the patterns and themes he was discovering in his comprehensive reading of the collection. One pattern that struck him particularly was the consistency with which different authors, writing in different centuries and different circumstances, returned to certain fundamental questions about the nature of God, the meaning of human life, and the best ways to live in accordance with divine will. While the specific answers varied somewhat depending on the author's background and the challenges of his historical period, the underlying concerns remained remarkably constant. Another pattern he noticed was the way in which scholarly work built upon previous scholarship, with each generation of writers drawing upon the insights of their predecessors while adding their own observations and understanding. This cumulative nature of intellectual development gave Brother Thomas a sense of participating in something much larger and more significant than his own individual efforts. Spring returned with its usual sense of renewal and hope, and Brother Thomas resumed his intensive work on the Index Project. He had completed detailed analysis of approximately 2/3 of the collection and was beginning to see the overall structure that the finished index would take. The work was both challenging and satisfying, requiring sustained concentration and careful attention to detail, while also engaging his creative abilities in organizing and presenting complex information. The monastery's agricultural work that spring was particularly successful, with favorable weather conditions producing excellent crops in all areas of their farming operation. Brother Thomas continued to participate in this physical labor when his other duties permitted, maintaining his appreciation for the balance between intellectual and manual work that characterized Benedictine monastic life. That spring also brought a special honor to the monastery, as they were selected to host a gathering of abbots from monasteries throughout their region. The meeting was intended to discuss common concerns and to coordinate responses to various challenges facing monastic communities in their area. Brother Thomas was appointed to assist with the logistical arrangements for this important gathering, working closely with the abbot and other senior monks to ensure that their guests would be properly accommodated. The gathering of abbots lasted for 4 days and included representatives from 12 different monasteries. The discussions covered a wide range of topics, from practical matters like agricultural techniques and manuscript preservation, to more complex issues involving relationships with secular authorities and the training of new monks. Brother Thomas found the conversations fascinating, as they provided insights into how different communities had addressed similar challenges and developed their own distinctive approaches to monastic life. One outcome of the abbots' gathering was an agreement to increase cooperation among the participating monasteries in areas like scholarly research and manuscript exchange. Brother Thomas was appointed to serve on a committee that would coordinate these collaborative efforts, a responsibility that would require him to maintain regular correspondence with librarians and scholars at other institutions. Summer brought the usual intensification of agricultural work, but it also marked a significant milestone in Brother Thomas's life at the monastery. He had now been a member of the community for 20 years, a period that encompassed his entire adult life and had shaped his understanding of himself and his place in the world. The abbot marked this anniversary with a special blessing during the community's evening prayers, acknowledging Brother Thomas's faithful service and his contributions to the monastery's intellectual and spiritual life. As he reflected on 2 decades of monastic life, Brother Thomas felt deep gratitude for the opportunities he had been given to serve, to learn, and to grow in wisdom and understanding. The young man who had arrived at the monastery's gates 20 years earlier had been sincere and well-intentioned, but he had possessed little real knowledge of the world or of himself. The years of prayer, work, and study had gradually transformed him into someone who could offer genuine guidance and assistance to others while continuing to learn and develop his own capabilities. The Index project was finally completed that autumn, representing nearly 3 years of systematic work and producing a comprehensive reference tool that would serve the monastery's scholars for generations to come. The finished index filled 2 substantial volumes and included not only topical references, but also geographical and chronological information that would help researchers understand the historical development of various ideas and themes. The completion of this major project left Brother Thomas with a sense of accomplishment, but also with some uncertainty about what his next scholarly focus should be. The abbot suggested that he might consider writing his own commentary on one of the books of Scripture, drawing upon the extensive reading and research he had done during his years as librarian and his work on the Index. The idea of writing original scholarly work was both exciting and intimidating. Brother Thomas had spent most of his intellectual life copying and studying the works of others, and the prospect of contributing his own insights and interpretations to the body of Christian scholarship represented a significant step forward in his development as a scholar and teacher. After much prayer and reflection, Brother Thomas decided to undertake a commentary on the Gospel of John, focusing particularly on its theological themes and their practical applications for Christian living. This choice reflected his belief that scholarly work should ultimately serve the spiritual needs of ordinary believers, not merely satisfy academic curiosity or advance theoretical knowledge. The commentary project would occupy Brother Thomas for the next several years, requiring him to bring together all of his learning and experience in service of helping others understand and apply one of the most profound and challenging books in the Christian scriptures. As he began this new phase of his scholarly work, he felt a deep sense of responsibility to the community that had nurtured his development and to the broader church that would ultimately benefit from his efforts. Winter settled over the monastery with its familiar rhythm of shortened days and increased emphasis on indoor activities. Brother Thomas established a routine that balanced his work on the gospel commentary with his ongoing responsibilities as guest master and his participation in the community's daily prayers and labor. The cold months provided ideal conditions for sustained scholarly work, with fewer distractions and more time for the deep concentration that complex theological writing required. As he worked through John's Gospel verse by verse, Brother Thomas was repeatedly struck by the evangelist's ability to present profound theological truths through simple stories and images. The Gospel's account of Jesus turning water into wine, healing the blind man, and raising Lazarus from the dead were narratives that even children could understand. Yet they contained layers of meaning that had challenged scholars and theologians for centuries. Brother Thomas's approach to commentary writing emphasized this accessibility while not sacrificing intellectual rigor. He wanted to produce a work that would be valuable to educated clergy and scholars, but would also be comprehensible to ordinary believers who were seeking deeper understanding of their faith. This balance required careful attention to language and organization, ensuring that complex ideas were explained clearly while maintaining respect for the sophistication of his readers. The work progressed steadily through the winter and into the following spring, as Brother Thomas established patterns of research, writing, and revision that allowed him to maintain consistent quality while making regular progress. He consulted extensively with other manuscripts in the monastery's collection, drawing upon the insights of earlier commentators while developing his own interpretations and applications. Spring brought not only the usual agricultural activities, but also news that would significantly impact Brother Thomas's work and the monastery's future development. The Pope had announced the establishment of a new university in a city approximately 100 miles from St. Benedict's Abbey, and he was seeking qualified scholars to serve as faculty members for the institution's theological school. The abbot received a formal invitation to nominate one of the monastery's scholars for consideration as a professor of biblical studies at the new university. After extensive prayer and consultation with the community's senior monks, he decided to nominate Brother Thomas, whose combination of scholarly achievement, teaching ability, and spiritual maturity made him an ideal candidate for such a position. The nomination letter described Brother Thomas's 21 years of faithful monastic life, his extensive knowledge of theological literature, his experience as librarian and guest master, and his current work on the Gospel of John commentary.
The abbot noted that while the monastery would be sorry to lose such a valued member, the opportunity to serve the broader church through university teaching represented a natural extension of the scholarly mission that had always been part of their community's calling. Brother Thomas received the news of his nomination with mixed emotions. The opportunity to teach at a university level and to influence the education of future church leaders was both an honor and a significant responsibility. At the same time, the prospect of leaving the monastery that had been his home for more than 2 decades and the community that had shaped his entire adult life was genuinely difficult to contemplate. The decision process extended over several months, during which Brother Thomas continued his regular duties while carefully considering the implications of accepting or declining the university position. He consulted with the abbot and other senior monks, seeking guidance about how to discern God's will in this important decision. He also spent additional time in prayer and meditation, asking for wisdom and clarity about the path he should follow. During this period of discernment, Brother Thomas completed the first draft of his commentary on the first 12 chapters of John's Gospel. The work represented his most substantial contribution to theological scholarship and demonstrated his ability to combine careful exegesis with practical application. Several monks who read portions of the draft praised both its scholarly quality and its spiritual insight, confirming that Brother Thomas had indeed developed the skills and knowledge necessary for university-level teaching. The invitation to join the university faculty was ultimately accepted, though not without considerable anguish about leaving the monastic community that had been central to his life for so many years. The abbot assured Brother Thomas that he would always have a home at St. Benedict's Abbey, and that his service at the university should be understood as an extension of his monastic vocation rather than a departure from it. The final months before Brother Thomas's departure were filled with intense activity as he worked to complete his commentary project and to ensure that his responsibilities as librarian and guest master would be properly transferred to other members of the community. The monastery's scriptorium produced a beautiful copy of the completed portions of his gospel commentary, creating a permanent record of his scholarly work that would remain in the Abbey's collection. The leave-taking was emotionally difficult for Brother Thomas and for the entire community. These monks had lived together, worked together, and prayed together for decades, developing bonds of affection and mutual respect that made separation painful, despite their understanding that such changes were sometimes necessary for the greater good of the Church's mission. As Brother Thomas prepared to begin his new life as a university professor, he reflected on the ways in which his monastic experience had prepared him for this different form of service. The discipline of daily prayer had taught him to maintain spiritual focus amid the demands of academic work. The experience of community life had given him insights into human nature and interpersonal relationships that would serve him well in working with students and colleagues. Most importantly, the years of study and contemplation had deepened his understanding of the Christian faith in ways that would inform and enrich his teaching for years to come. The journey to the university took 3 days, during which Brother Thomas traveled with a small group of fellow scholars who were also joining the new institution's faculty. The conversations during this journey helped him begin to envision his new life and to understand the opportunities and challenges that university teaching would present. The university was housed in a complex of newly constructed buildings that reflected the latest architectural innovations while maintaining the traditional elements that were considered appropriate for an institution of higher learning. The library was particularly impressive, containing several thousand volumes that had been assembled from monasteries and cathedral schools throughout Europe. Brother Thomas's appointment as professor of biblical studies carried significant responsibilities, including the development of curriculum for both undergraduate and graduate students, the supervision of advanced research projects, and participation in the university's broader academic mission.
His monastic background was considered an asset rather than a limitation, as university officials recognized the value of the scholarly traditions that had been preserved and developed in monastic institutions.
The transition from monastic to university life required considerable adjustment, particularly in terms of the more complex social environment and the greater emphasis on public recognition of scholarly achievement. However, Brother Thomas found that his years of monastic formation had given him a solid foundation for navigating these new challenges while maintaining his commitment to learning and service. His first year of university teaching was both demanding and rewarding, as he worked to develop effective approaches to educating young men who came from diverse backgrounds and had varying levels of preparation for serious theological study. The experience of working with Brother David and other young monks at the monastery had given him valuable insights into how to adapt his teaching methods to meet different learning needs and capabilities. The Gospel Commentary Project continued during his university years, eventually growing into a comprehensive work that became widely used in theological schools throughout Europe. The commentary reflected Brother Thomas's unique combination of monastic spirituality, scholarly rigor, and pastoral concern for practical application of biblical truth. As the years passed, Brother Thomas maintained regular correspondence with St. Benedict's Abbey and made periodic visits when his university obligations permitted. These connections with his monastic roots remained important to him, providing spiritual renewal and reminding him of the values and priorities that had shaped his fundamental approach to life and scholarship. The university years brought new challenges and opportunities for growth, but they also confirmed the wisdom of the foundational years that Brother Thomas had spent in monastic community. The discipline of regular prayer, the commitment to service above self-interest, and the integration of intellectual work with spiritual development that he had learned at the monastery continued to guide his work and relationships in the very different environment of university life. Looking back over the decades that had passed since his arrival at St. Benedict's Abbey as a young man of 18,
Brother Thomas could see the hand of divine providence in the various changes and developments that had marked his journey. The quiet years of copying manuscripts, tending gardens, and participating in the daily rhythm of monastic prayer had prepared him in ways he could not have imagined for the more public role he eventually assumed as a university professor and theological writer. The story of Brother Thomas's life illustrates the way in which apparently ordinary daily activities, when carried out with faithfulness and dedication over many years, can prepare a person for extraordinary service and achievement. His experience suggests that the most important preparation for future responsibilities often occurs through patient attention to present duties, regardless of how mundane or limited they may seem at the time. The medieval monastery represented a form of life that modern people may find difficult to understand or appreciate, with its emphasis on routine, discipline, and submission to community authority. However, the example of communities like St. Benedict's Abbey demonstrates that such institutions could nurture human development and scholarly achievement, while also preserving and transmitting the intellectual and spiritual treasures of their civilization. Brother Thomas's story concludes not with his departure from the monastery, but with his continued service in a new context, carrying forward the values and insights he had gained during his formative years of monastic life. His experience suggests that true vocation is not necessarily tied to a particular place or role, but rather to a fundamental orientation towards service, learning, and spiritual growth that can be expressed in various ways throughout a person's life. As evening settles over the medieval world we have been exploring together, we can imagine Brother Thomas in his university study, working by candlelight on a lecture he will deliver the next day to eager young students. The same bell that once called him to prayer in the monastery now rings across the university campus, reminding all who hear it that human learning and achievement find their ultimate meaning in service to something greater than themselves. The quiet dedication that characterized his monastic years continues to guide his work as a teacher and scholar, demonstrating that the most profound changes in a person's circumstances need not diminish the essential commitments that give life its deepest meaning and purpose. And with that thought, dear friends, we conclude our journey through a single day that expanded into a lifetime of faithful service, and I wish you all a peaceful good night.